Hello and bonjour, I am Sarah Bokhari and you're watching Power Dilemma here at TAGTV.
Canada's former Conservative government oversaw and supported the highest levels of planned immigration in recent Canadian history. Canada's Conservatives continue to strongly support a balanced, fair, and compassionate asylum process in Canada. However, the reality is that Justin Trudeau has failed on all of these fronts. Frankly, I believe that the Prime Minister has ruined what was once a fair, orderly system that focused on both protecting the world's most vulnerable and aiding their integration into Canada's social and economic fabric. This is because since January 2017, over 30,000 individuals have illegally crossed the border from the United States into Canada and subsequently claimed asylum in our country. This dramatic increase in numbers occurred after the Prime Minister tweeted #Welcome to Canada in response to an executive order made by the American government. To reiterate, over 30,000 people have illegally entered Canada and then claimed asylum after already having reached the safety of the United States of America. By this government's own admission, many of these people do not have valid asylum claims and will eventually be found to have no legal reason to be in Canada. This high level of unplanned immigration has created strain on provincial social welfare programs and integration supports. It has also directed hundreds of millions of dollars of unbudgeted resources and support that could have been used to expedite those languishing in UN refugee camps, those seeking to have their family members reunited with them in Canada, or Canadians in need, to people who are in the United States of America.
Canada is dealing with an influx of illegal migrants. About 20,000 asylum seekers walked across the Canada-US border last year, and the numbers remain high in 2018. Toronto Mayor John Tory is calling for immediate action on the part of the federal government to set up and provide further assistance to support the influx of refugees and asylum seekers in the city. We have exhausted our available sites, our resources, and our personnel, Tory told recently at a city council meeting. We need the other levels of government to step up and assist Toronto in a true partnership, and I would say that primary leadership and partnership role in that regard rests with the Government of Canada. The federal government announced earlier that Ontario will receive $11 million of the $50 million to help pay for some of the costs of asylum seekers illegally crossing the Canada-US border. But Tory said although the money is appreciated, there still is a lack of direction and leadership when it comes to housing new arrivals. They should be stepping forward and saying we have a place or series of places where we can actually take a degree of this responsibility on and help Toronto to do the right thing for these families. There are currently more than 3,000 refugees and asylum seekers using the city's shelter system, and temporary dormitories at 2 Toronto colleges used to house 800 people, and they must be vacated by August the 9th, which is tomorrow. Although an exhaustive search for additional shelter capacity is being pursued with federal and provincial colleagues, still no appropriate sites for additional shelter space for refugees/asylum claimants have been identified, the report said. After hurling accusations of creating hysteria, crippling provinces, and taking an ad hoc approach to a crisis, MPs on the Immigration Committee agreed recently to hold special hearings on the influx of people illegally crossing the border to claim asylum in Canada. Conservative immigration critique Michelle Rempel presented the motion for the summer sessions, insisting the Liberal government has failed to produce a comprehensive, costed plan. She accused the government of normalizing the trend of irregular border crossers and wants to hold key ministers to account. Calling it a border crisis, Rempel said the issue has taken on new urgency because many refugee claimants currently housed in university dorms will face eviction in early August, and August 9th is the date given. Cities such as Toronto and Ottawa are buckling under the strain of stretched resources, overcrowded shelters, and increased demand on food banks, she said. Rempel accused the Liberal government of accepting the ongoing situation without a long-term permanent plan to ensure adequate supports and funds are in place to deal with the steady influx. So to talk about the refugee crisis in Canada, particularly at the border of Canadian border with the U.S. We have in our Power Dilemma TAGTV studio my very worthy guest, Advocate Mr. Ali Naqvi, and he is an advocate for refugees and immigrants. And on phone we have a former Citizenship and Immigration Minister, Mr. Chris Alexander. Welcome to my show.
Thank you so much, Sarah.
Okay.
Thank you, Sarah.
You're welcome. So my first question is to you, Mr. Chris Alexander. Mr. Alexander, do you think that Canada is facing a crisis, a refugee crisis?
It is a crisis. It's nothing on the scale that Europe faced, or indeed that the United States has faced over decades, with millions of illegal migrants coming to the country and not having their situation addressed. I think this is really the trigger for our smaller crisis. The United States is a country, many of our partners in Europe are now societies where immigration and migration issues have become hot buttons because, and politics indeed has polarized because of these very large-scale unresolved issues. For Canada, this really goes back to the election of Donald Trump. He hasn't held up the United States' obligations under international law to asylum seekers. He's discriminating against people based on nationality and religion. He's allowing the continuing mistreatment of families and children at the southern border. And for that reason, people are crossing our border. They have new reasons to cross our border and claim asylum here. Yes, it is illegal to cross our border without coming through one of the points of entry, without being inspected. But asylum seekers have the right to make their case. And given that the United States is a less hospitable, a less safe country for certain categories of asylum seekers, we have a duty to uphold our full range of responsibilities under international law. But we should be doing this the right way, and that is by receiving asylum claims at points of entry, turning back convicted criminals there, restoring order to this situation, and dealing with a backlog that has grown very, very, very quickly. I'm less concerned about the numbers and the phenomenon we're dealing with out of the United States. I'm very concerned about the backlog our Liberal government has allowed. When we left office at the end of 2015, there were about 10,000 asylum claims to be processed in the backlog, awaiting a hearing. Now that has risen in just over 2 years to 50,000. This is absurd. This is the real danger, forcing people to wait 2 years for a hearing. We need a government that demonstrates more competence than this one has done so far.
Okay, so I will direct my question to Mr. Naqvi, who is an advocate for immigrants and refugees and asylum seekers. Do you think, Mr. Naqvi, that Canada is facing a refugee crisis right at this time?
Well, let me start by saying Mr. Alexander's comments just now have earned him respect from somebody who has been on the other side of the political sphere. I always recognize Mr. Alexander's services as a diplomat for Canada, but today, Mr. Alexander, the position you have presented is real humanitarian, and thank you really very much for that. Any solvable problem, when it faces incompetent government, turns into a crisis. And yes, now this is a mini crisis and turning into a major crisis. And it's not because of the causes in the United States. When Mr. Trump came to power and started making legislation, executive orders, the Muslim ban, and eventually the detention of minors, etc., etc., we all were aware that there will be an influx of human beings coming to Canada. But then the real cause of the problem is a tweet by our own Honorable Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, who on January 28, 2017 said and tweeted, to those fleeing persecution, terror and war, Canadians will welcome you. Regardless of your faith, diversity is our strength. There were about 500,000 retweets and almost 1 million likes to that tweet. Now, immediately after that, of course, our MPs, Spanish-speaking MPs, were sent into the United States to the Spanish-speaking communities, telling them, don't come to Canada because you can be deported. We may or may not be able to give you fairness in terms of legislation and practical approaches, which was incorrect. So that was the deterrent. So on one hand, our Honorable Prime Minister is tweeting, come on in, we are open for all persecuted. On the other hand, underground, we are sending out our MPs telling people not to come to Canada. So the solution of this mini crisis lies with either suspending, modernizing, or repealing single-handedly on our side the Safe Third Country Treaty. That creates the lacuna for people to come to the illegal crossings. Under the Safe Third Country Treaty, which is only applicable on legal border crossings, people who are persecuted or fear persecution in the safe country that this treaty claims to be, the United States, have no other means to the end of coming to Canada. They come to the Quebec border, they come to the Manitoba border, some to the BC, and enter Canada and make these refugee claims. So unless and until there is political will on all sides to either repeal, modernize, or suspend the treaty and accept the fact that, as Mr. Alexander pointed towards, that America is not a hospitable country to the persecuted of the world anymore. So this is the solution to the minor crisis that we are facing today, which can turn into a very major one.
Okay, thank you. So Chris, I have a question for you. Now that we have this huge influx of asylum seekers in Toronto, and tomorrow is August the 9th, they are ordered to be vacating those hostel dormitories, and they're supposed to go to these hotels. Where is the Liberal government getting the funds and the monies to pay for these asylum seekers? And Chris, how many are them who are going to these hotels? Isn't it the money coming out from our pocket, from the taxpayers' pocket, which the Liberal government is just spending on asylum seekers? That is a very important question our listeners would like to know.
Yes, the money is coming out of our pockets, and yes, there will have to be a lot of it, given the backlog and the disorder, which, as my colleague Mr. Naqvi points out, the Liberals themselves have created. There is an obligation today under Canadian law to give an asylum seeker a hearing in no more than 2 months, 60 days. And for certain asylum seekers from certain countries, it should be in no less than 30 days. Now new claimants are being told that they will not be heard for 2 years, in some cases more than 2 years. And that places a burden on them of having to wait in uncertainty and put their lives on hold for an excessive period of time, and on us, Canadian taxpayers, municipalities, communities, who really weren't expecting this particular bombshell to be landing near them. And so what's the solution? Resource all the partners in this enterprise properly. That's what we tried to do in government. That's what successful Canadian governments have always done on the immigration front. This government is so far failing on that front. And secondly, resource the Immigration and Refugee Board, the the RCMP, the Canadian Border Services Agency, properly to reduce the backlog and restore order at the border. And I absolutely agree with Mr. Naqvi that we should be suspending the Safe Third Country Agreement. We should have done this over a year ago with when the first announcement of President-elect Donald Trump's immigration initiatives, which are clear violations of international law in some cases and clear violations of that bilateral agreement, which we only have with the United States when those came out. You know, the paradox is that if one is a British citizen or a Pakistani citizen or Chinese or French from any other country in the world, you can come to a Canadian point of entry, a port of entry to an airport, come by ship, come to a land border crossing, and make an asylum claim. But if you're coming from the United States, you cannot.
Okay, so Mr. Naqvi, you referred that in order to take care of the refugee crisis in Canada, this Safe Third Country Treaty with the U.S., it should be suspended. If you can just elaborate on that.
Well, the Safe Third Country Treaty, first of all, assumes that United States is a safe country. So under the Safe Third Country Treaty, the first country of opportunity where you can make an asylum or a refugee claim, you need to make that. So if somebody comes to the United States, they have to make that asylum claim in United States. However, that is only applicable on the legal border crossings. So you have your Queenston-Lewiston Bridge, your Buffalo and Fort Erie border, the Rainbow. You have your Lacolle near Montreal, and all other legal border crossings. Mm-hmm. It's not applicable on illegal border crossings.
Okay.
So the law has this big lacuna in there. Secondly, and most importantly, there is a clause in the Safe Third Country Treaty that there will be ongoing reviews. And the reviews have to look at 4 factors. So the factor one, whether United States is a signatory to 2 international treaties. One is Convention Against Torture and the other the Refugee Convention of 1951, which it is. Factor 2, which is a big concern, is the policies and practices with respect to the claims under the 1951 Refugee Convention and obligations under the Convention of Torture. Now here, we have big concerns. We as Canadians should have big concern. Whether or not America is following the policies and practices under these 2 international body of legislations. In my humble opinion, it is not. From the Convention Against Torture to the refugee obligations, they have failed to fulfill. Convention Against Torture, they have been coming up from Mr. Bush administration to Mr. Obama's administration with certain waivers that, you know, torture may be allowed in armed conflict, torture may be allowed outside United States. Now, refugees and asylum seekers, we see children in cages in United States. We saw the Muslim ban, Muslim travel ban. And then when Mr. Trump, President Trump, I should say, changes its policy to separate children from its asylum seeker parents, he said, well, now we are going to jail them together. So this is not a safe country. Canada should take up the review, which was recently taken up by the minister. And however, they decided that we still, United States still qualifies to be a Safe Third Country Treaty. The problem is, as I'm the last one to agree with Mr. Tory, but there is no political will, there is no leadership. This government is a government by perception. They create false perceptions, and we follow those perceptions unless and until they come up with a plan, and they're not big on plans.
Okay, so at this time, Chris, I'm going to get back to you. Getting this point that what is this government doing? you know, they're saying there are lots of asylum seekers in Toronto. Why don't they take the asylum seekers, refugee claimants, to other provinces like New Brunswick or, you know, other provinces other than Ontario? Chris?
Well, I think they are making an attempt to spread the burden. Most have arrived in Quebec, and Quebec is bearing a large share of the burden. Some other provinces have been included, but I think the bottom line is, as Mr. Naqvi says, you can spread these people all across the country. You can lavish taxpayers' funds on them, but you're still going to have a crisis if you don't deal with the fundamental issue, which is an unexpectedly large number of new asylum claims that need to be heard. And this government seems to not understand that it's the IRB, only the IRB, that can resolve this issue for them. The IRB actually spent, and the Canadian Border Services Agency, less money last year than they did 2 years ago. How that is possible, given the circumstances of these 50,000 claims now in the backlog, a government that is essentially in contempt of Canadian statute in terms of the waiting times they're now imposing on asylum seekers, it's totally irresponsible. And so the misery of municipalities and taxpayers is compounded by the misery of these asylum seekers who really ought to have their claims heard in a month or two. Moreover, as Mr. Naqvi says, if we were without the Safe Third Country Agreement and able to receive these claims at the border, we would have an instant benefit in terms of the safety and security of Canadians, because convicted criminals who would not be able to make such claims, and those who've already made claims in Canada and had them rejected would also be able to be turned back at the border. That is a best practice in asylum law and asylum policy. We should be implementing it now rather than forcing people to proceed unsafely across field and forest in southern Quebec and Manitoba.
Chris, you have just referred, you know, the safety and security of Canadians. So it is extremely important to understand that how is the security paradigm is going to be affected by these asylum and refugee claimants we do not know anything about. We do not know their background. So how is the security of Canadians going to be affected by the presence of the asylum and refugee seekers?
Yeah, well, I think people need to understand that all the available evidence says that there isn't a huge threat to Canada from these people. These are people who receive visas, who come to the United States because they don't require visas or have received visas to enter the United States. So they've undergone a certain amount of screening already, and under President Trump, obviously more screening in some respects, extreme forms of screening, as he puts it. But let's look at the big picture. We have a backlog of 50,000 asylum seekers, most of whom have crossed from the United States. We have to look after them now for 2 years because the IRB hasn't been resourced properly. This is going to really bend our refugee and asylum institutions out of shape as they look after this group. In the meantime, Canadians want to continue and strengthen our reputation as a country that receives a large number of the world's most vulnerable. Syrians, other victims of conflict in Africa, the Middle East, Asia, Latin America, elsewhere, who have nowhere else to go. And this at a time when the United States has abdicated leadership on refugee resettlement. The United States is resettling safely refugees from around the world in fewer numbers than Canada. So that's for the first time in our history. And they are discriminating against Muslims. So who would we rather lavish our generosity on? On the world's most vulnerable, people who are being actively persecuted and may not survive if they don't receive our protection, or people who've taken a punt on a visa to the U.S. and made an asylum claim here, but otherwise lead relatively safe and prosperous middle-class lives in the countries where they are. Now, my choice is clear. I want us to focus on the most vulnerable. I'm not saying that people walking across the border are not deserving. Some of them are. And only the IRB can determine who is who. But everyone understands that asylum seekers, people who get U.S. visas, people who can afford plane tickets, people who get organized, sometimes with the help of human trafficking networks, to walk across the border, are much less needy, facing less urgent forms of persecution than people we see in refugee camps in Africa and the Middle East. And this is a distraction from what we should really be doing, and the government has utterly failed to show leadership. You cannot claim to be a leader on refugee resettlement and then say that everything is fine in the United States and we're not suspending the Safe Third Country Agreement at the same time. That is a contradiction. That is hypocrisy, and sooner or later this government's going to have to face it.
Okay, so Mr. Naqvi, the question is, what are the most vulnerable refugees? The refugees coming from across Canada, or refugees who are still waiting in war-torn countries like Syria and other war-torn countries? And of course, security. I'm just going to ask you that question in a bit.
Okay. So we, as Mr. Alexander said, we cannot be the judge of these people. You see, I'm of the opinion, and a very staunch opinion, that anybody who comes to Canada from overseas, may it be like my father who came as an investor entrepreneur, or you know, an academic or a peace activist like you, or we all seek refuge in Canada. I'm of the opinion, and when I say so, a lot of people dislike me for that. We are all refugees. We all sought the refuge of this great country. And we should first of all acknowledge that we are sitting in Mississauga today, rightly owners of which are the First Nations of Mississauga. They host us. And because of the nature of this land, its water and its air, there is this accommodation. And that is why we are one of the greatest people on earth today, that we share, we accommodate, we look after each other. We are not the judges of who's a criminal or not. It's the RCMP, the CSIS, the Canada Border Services Agency. And Mr. Alexander, I have come across news articles and cases where people who had criminal backgrounds were apprehended by our great RCMP at the illegal crossings. So there is screening available there as well. When it comes,
it's just not ideal.
It is not. Yes, it is not. And you know, compared to what we have available at the regular port of entry, what we have at irregular or illegal border crossings is not comparable. Yes, but still, we have that. We have the best public service in the world, the most diligent public service officers in the world.
Yeah, but we don't want people to just misuse the privilege of being in Canada.
Well, and you know,
we don't want criminals in Canada.
We don't want criminals in Canada, but we should not victimize anybody who's seeking refugee claim at a legal or illegal border cross, just assuming that he or she may be a criminal, because there are policies in place, there are protocols in place, and
I absolutely agree with that. And Sarah, we cannot accuse these asylum claimants of abusing our generosity when it is our government that has created this backlog, that is forcing them to wait 2 hours, that is not upholding our own legal standards for hearing. It's not the asylum seekers that have created that situation, it is the government. They could easily have resourced the IRB properly and kept these timelines intact. They have instead demonstrated gross incompetence and created a problem of which we taxpayers are victims and the asylum claimants as well.
Okay, so Mr. Naqvi pointed out our very worthy First Nations, and we are at the, in Mississauga, which is very important First Nation, first abode. So the question is, Canada originally belonged to the First Nation people. So the question is, isn't the Liberal government doing far more for the new asylum seekers than they have done to the First Nations?
Well, the government of Canada has done, frankly, nothing for the First Nations. You know, right here in Ontario, there are 22 communities without drinking water, without safe drinking water.
So how can we keep on accepting more and more asylum seekers and refugees?
Human is a human. We cannot, going to gross incompetence of the Liberals, they have made promises and they have broken promises. These people are used to telling the untruth and making false claims. However, in regards to looking after the asylum seekers, it's we under the international law and our domestic law take this responsibility honorably. We have done it for the Syrian refugees. We have done it for refugees from world over, from the boat people to the Sikhs over 100 years ago. I forgot the name of that ship. We have made apologies after decades. Exactly, thank you. We have made apologies after decades of those injustices that we have done, and rightly so. We should not continue to make those injustices.
Yeah, the easiest way to explain this, Sarah, is to say we have treaties with First Nations, thanks to which we live here. The Crown has obligations under those treaties. Those need to be upheld. At the same time, we as a country are parties to international conventions that have the status of treaties, that are treaties, including the Refugee Convention, including other conventions governing treatment of asylum seekers. We need to uphold those as well. There is no contradiction. Our respect for treaties at home and abroad needs to be consistent.
So moving forward, Chris, what should the Liberal government do? How, Liberal government is failing, clearly. What should it be doing to...
suspend the Safer Country Agreement, resource the IRB properly, and give the Canadian Border Services Agency and the RCMP the resources they need to do a good job at the border, at our ports of entry, for these claimants that are coming across. This will turn a crisis into a very manageable situation and allow us to continue to focus on the world's most vulnerable, resettling those globally most in need at a time when the United States and other countries are refusing to show any leadership on these issues. Okay,
Mr. Naqvi.
Well, what the Liberal government should start doing is actually doing its job. They should start doing their job. Until now, their only agenda is, under false pretenses, how to win the next elections. We elected them, unfortunately, to manage this country. They have failed to do so. May it be foreign affairs, may it be environment, may it be the immigration file, may it be the finance. They have failed Canadians left, right, and center. However, in regards to this specific issue that we are dealing with today, unless and until the Refugee Board, Immigration and Refugee Board, has enough resources, both human and financial, to deal with this backlog, the files would not be resolved unless and until you have an unresolved, as long as you have an unresolved file, the claimant is a responsibility, may or may not be a responsibility on the federal interim federal health plan. So the medical coverage is coming from there, and they may or may not be on social assistance of the province. Once these people, our good people, become either accepted as conventional refugee or denied, in case if they are denied, they go into the judicial review or appellate process, whichever is available. If they fail, they can be removed. And once again, CBSA needs to have the resources to implement those removal proceedings. But we need to focus on the positive and provide the resources to Immigration and Refugee Board. Immigration and Refugee Board had drastic cuts. There are less than 50% members of the board who are hearing these claims these days. From Vancouver to Calgary to Montreal to Toronto, they have closed down Ottawa. Operations in Calgary were suspended until recently. The 60-day timeline for finalizing the claims have been suspended. You're not resolving the matter. And why this is not happening? This is not happening because the government does not have a plan. And why the government does not have a plan? Because they want this crisis to evolve into a major crisis and then maybe do something near the elections.
Oh, okay. So you think, Chris, they are going to buy votes by creating a sympathy, by blowing up the refugee crisis?
I'm not sure. You know, I tend not to believe in conspiracy theories, but I do believe that some governments are just not very competent. And I think this is one of those that falls into that category. I think they were surprised by this issue. I don't think they've understood the institutional consequences, and I don't think they've reacted well.
Okay, gentlemen, thank you so much for being a part of Power Dilemma today at TAGTV. Thank you very much, former Minister of Citizenship and Immigration Canada, Chris Alexander. And thank you very much, Mr. Ali Naqvi, who is an advocate of refugees and immigrants. And folks, we talked about the crisis of refugees in Canada, which is a big crisis to be solved, and we had our worthy guests and they gave solutions, and I hope our present government should take steps favorable to resolving this crisis. Stay tuned till we meet next week. Like our Facebook page. Take care. Ciao.